Hello everyone, I'm bringing a video today with a return to some British Second World War kit. And what we're talking about here is a very basic bit of British kit from that era, and that's the basic pouches from the 1937 pattern web equipment. Now, in some previous videos and comment sections on some previous videos, I've actually had people asking, how was ammunition carried in these? And of course, the reason for the introduction of these pouches was really to allow for the carriage of the 30-round magazines for the Bren light machine gun. But you can carry, and of course you do carry, rifle ammunition in them as well in charges, for either loading into the rifle directly from the chargers or for reloading Bren gun magazines. And of course grenades and so forth could be carried as well. So we can have a quick look at these and look at how ammunition could be carried in these. We'll probably talk a little bit about the post-war use of these as well. Obviously they were compatible with post-war developments in the weapons used by the British Army. So we'll have a quick look at this now, and I say it's a topic which is probably very familiar to a lot of viewers, and most of you probably won't find a huge amount of new information here, but for those who aren't sure about this, hopefully it'll be interesting and interesting to have a look at this. And I say it's prompted by comments on previous videos where people have been basically asking exactly this. So we're going to have a look at this in some detail now. So here we have the two basic pouches. These have been loaded with typical contents for a rifleman in an infantry section. And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in just a minute. Obviously this topic was probably very familiar to many viewers. So if you're watching, regardless, thank you very much for watching on a topic you probably already know a great deal about. For those who aren't familiar or aren't as familiar with British Second War kit, hopefully this will be interesting and informative. These basic pouches are Mark IIIs. They're obviously early production Mark IIIs. They still have the press stud or snap here on the closure, no drainage eyelet in the bottom. So they predate the quick release, the introduction of the quick release closure and the drainage eyelet in the bottom of the pouch. They of course did appear during the course of the Second World War, a very late war manufacture, and do turn up in some photos towards the very end of the war, but these would be the more typical Mark IIIs to see during that middle part of the war, and they're slightly improved over the Mark I and Mark II. I have covered this in detail elsewhere on the channel, but mention it briefly here. They're slightly larger, slightly taller as it were, and therefore you can carry Sten magazines in these, the magazines for the Sten machine carbine. We won't be looking at those today. I actually don't have an original Sten magazine in the collection. I should really add one, and a Sten itself at some point, other than the gas blowback airsoft example I was very kindly sent by Northeast Airsoft. But anyway, that's getting off the main topic of the video here. I will have to pick up one of those at some point, and as I say, these are modified so that the Sten gun magazines will fit. What we have in these is more typical of a rifleman in an infantry section, and one thing I mentioned in the intro is these are of course designed, at least in part, around the introduction of the Bren light machine gun and the box magazines for that. And as we'll see here, riflemen in an infantry section also carry magazines for the Bren. Part of their job is to help keep the Bren firing, keep feeding the Bren basically. And in the right hand pouches we're looking at it here, which of course would be the left hand pouch if these were worn on the belt and being carried, we have the magazines for the Bren light machine gun. And as you can see, they're a nice fit in here in the Mark III. They can be a tight fit in Mark I's and II's, especially if they've shrunk slightly over the years. But in a Mark III, you shouldn't have any problems getting two Bren magazines in there. Obviously, if these were fully loaded, you'd have 60 rounds in there in the two box magazines. Obviously, they were quite commonly downloaded to give a bit extra reliability. You may have 2 or 3 fewer rounds in each magazine, but in theory a total carriage there of 60 rounds in 2 Bren gun magazines. So these would be provided to the Bren group within the infantry section as required to help keep the Bren firing. So the riflemen basically all carried Bren gun magazines in one of their basic pouches. In the other basic pouch we have a mix of rifle ammunition and grenades, and the rifle ammunition is carried in a bandolier, and I've left the strap for this loose at the top so it's easy to withdraw. This of course carries 50 rounds, 10 rounds per pocket. There are 2 charges in each pocket. This particular example is dated 1945, as you can see there, and the ammunition inside here is of course carried in charges. All the ammunition shown in this video is inert, of course. That's something to note here. All the primers have been struck and there's no powder in these. You have 2 5-round charges of 303 ammunition in each pocket, stacked like that so they fit neatly inside. And as required, the bandolier could be withdrawn, slung around the body for ease of access to the ammunition. This is a basic ammunition load, as we have here in the pouches. Additional bandoliers of ammunition could also be issued, and of course the ammunition was issued out in bandoliers in clips like this. So you could carry an extra 2 of these potentially, and give you an extra 100 rounds of ammunition. These could then of course be not only be used to feed your own rifle, to reload your own rifle, but could also be used to reload Bren gun magazines to again keep the Bren firing. So bandoliers are used to carry the ammunition in charges like this, and obviously you could in theory fit 2 of these inside a basic pouch, but in this case we have 1 bandolier and we have 2 grenades in the bottom of the pouch. We'll pull these out here. We have here, these are both just sort of resin copies, and this is the 3D printed one. Not particularly good reproductions, but they are what they are. We have a number 36 mils bomb and a 69 grenade here as well. So just examples of the grenades that could be carried. In a typical rifleman's load of ammunition, it might be more common generally to see 2 mils bombs perhaps. The 69 is a slightly more specialised grenade, but just an example there of 2 grenades that could easily be carried in the pouch underneath that bandolier of ammunition. So they fit neatly in there side by side and just slot down in the bottom there, no problem. And we'll get the light in there a little bit and you can see they'll fit down in the bottom of there, no problem at all. So as I say, these are very versatile. That's a typical load for a rifleman. As I say, would be maybe a couple of grenades, rifle ammunition above that, and then 2 Bren gun magazines. The number 1 on the Bren would likely have just Bren gun magazines, so you'd have 2 in each for a total of, in theory, again, 120 rounds there, but it'd be slightly less because the magazines tended not to be loaded with 30 rounds. And that would be typical for number 1 on the Bren gun, that is to say that the chap actually firing the Bren. And again, you could carry extra ammunition. As mentioned, you could have extra bandoliers slung around the body to carry extra ammunition. But that just gives you an idea here of the versatility of these and the capacity of them as well. Obviously, you've got 50 rounds for the rifle there, a theoretical total of 60 rounds for the Bren, and then 2 grenades as well, all carried within these pouches. And a lot more versatile in that regard than the preceding 1908 equipment, as mentioned. One of the reasons these are called basic pouches is obviously they're designed to allow the carriage of a basic ammunition load. They are the basic pouch that forms part of the 1937 pattern Webb equipment, as opposed to other pouches which are auxiliary to that, auxiliary pouches which we'll talk about in a future video. There were cartridge carriers intended for non-infantry troops, generally speaking, certainly earlier on in the war, but the uses of those sort of drops away, and these very much become standard because they do allow for they are very versatile. They allow for a very varied ammunition load to be carried as required, although, as I say, what we've looked at here is fairly typical, and that's the reason for looking at this sort of setup. What we're going to look at next is a post-war situation, and why these were able to remain in service. They are basically just a large open pouch inside, so they can cater for a lot of different types of magazine, shapes of magazine and so forth, and we'll have a look at that now. So looking at this from a sort of post-war context, we have 2 magazines from post-war British small arms here, the 1950s. We have the 20-round box magazine from the L1A1 self-loading rifle, and to the right of that we have the 30-round magazine, primarily intended for use with the L4 light machine gun, which is of course the conversion of the Bren light machine gun for use with 7.62 NATO ammunition. So these, obviously they're very similar width, these two. In fact, they are cross-compatible. You can put an L4 magazine onto an L1A1, of course, and vice versa. They will fit neatly together in there, as you can see. There's no problem fitting 2 magazines in there of this depth. And you can see that there's no problem with the height of the magazine for the L4 there. You can get the flap closed, no problem at all. As would be expected, it's basically not really any taller than a 303 Bren gun magazine. So these pouches, the 1937 pattern Webb equipment as a whole, there was no real problem with these carrying on in service. Obviously, it did carry on in use with some second line units for quite some time. There are photographs dating from the early 1980s showing 1937 pattern still in use, though 1958 pattern had been around by quite some time by that point. The Royal Navy held onto large stocks of it as well, sort of as a contingency in case of war. And it would have been serviceable, and not up to date by any means, but it would have been serviceable because of these basic pouches. And this is in contrast to sort of Second War US equipment and indeed German equipment as well, and certain other countries as well. If you look across the board, the British equipment in having these large universal basic pouches it meant that the equipment it had a longer service life ahead of it, I think you could say, because this change had already been made. And obviously for the US, you ended up with the M1956 equipment introducing pouches which were somewhat universal to replace cartridge belts and so forth designed around each individual weapon. And this is true of the Germans as well. Obviously you have different pouches for different types of weapons. Of course, this eventually comes full circle because you end up with specific pouches that are designed to take the standard NATO 5.56 magazines, which the L85A1 used, of course, well, the L85 generally uses. And therefore you end up with pouches on the very late 1980s. The personal load carrying equipment introduces pouches which are sort of designed around a specific type of magazine, as opposed to something a bit more universal like this. And obviously the 1958 pattern, which had preceded it, continued to use large pouches which would carry both 20-round magazines for the SLR and the 30-round magazines for the L4. And of course they were used to carry the 5.56 magazines for the L85 as well, before personal load carrying equipment was introduced. So just a move away there in the late 1980s towards the very end of the Cold War, the British Army moved away from equipment with large pouches which could carry different types of magazine, different ammunition loads, to something that was a bit more standardized and was intended at least to carry a specific design of magazine, although the pouches were used to carry different things as well, of course, on the personal load carrying equipment. So we're getting off topic a little bit there, just talking about further developments in the later Cold War, but just thought I'd mention that here. It's when you finally see that break away from equipment with larger pouches designed to carry a varied load within them, which sort of started with the 1937 pattern equipment, certainly as far as the British Army is concerned. So I hope you found it interesting looking at that. Obviously a lot more versatile, as mentioned in the video, a lot more versatile than the preceding designs, the cartridge carriers, the 1908 pattern equipment. Of course, designed with the Bren light machine gun in mind, but it does make for a more versatile method of carrying ammunition, magazines. You can carry charges, as we saw in the video. And of course, post-war, this meant that the pouches were still perfectly good and usable with the new weapons introduced after the Second World War. So I hope it's been interesting. As I say, if you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Whether you're new to subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using both of those methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are also linked in the description. And if you'd like to get in touch with me but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.